and welcome to Season 7, Episode 1. And we are back, and it is spring in full swing. And today we have a very special guest on the show. This is his second time here, Jason Quitt, who is out with a new book with some really amazing information in it. And I really am excited to have him here and have you all listen to all these wonderful new insights into the ancient world and our modern times. Hey, Jason, how are we doing?
Great. Good to be back. Good to see you again.
Very good. So this is a new book you've got.
Yes.
And this is somewhat on the theme of the last book.
It is.
But it's focusing in a different area that some people aren't too familiar with. And in my mind, to set this up a little bit, I think that this is one of the most important places of history that we have, is Sumeria, and the Babylon and the very ancient lands there of the I think it was called the Near East forever. For myself, I got into it through Sitchin, and in the late 90s, read the 12th Planet. And it was very slanted to his opinion as to what the interpretations were. You could tell it was he was guiding the conversation along in the book, but very insightful too. A lot of really interesting perspectives on pictographs and the written language and all that. I bought the book and handed it out to people because I thought it was that valuable of information, that of the insight of a different way of looking at the world and the potential history of humankind, but again, slanted very heavy in his opinion. You bring a fresh look, and I would say also a new perspective in the way that we look at the written word and the symbolism in the pictures. And you did the same with the hieroglyphs in Egypt, saying that there's more to see here, more that's going on than face value. And you also went around the world through pictographs, and you find this the symbolism throughout the world. Now you put your lens on Sumeria and Babylon, Akkadian. Could you tell us a little bit about why the Sumerians are important to us and some of the discoveries you found along the way?
Sure. They say all roads lead back to Rome. It's a pretty common saying. But if you're looking at biblical history, you're looking at Egypt and you're looking at Babylon. And when you start to study Sumerian history, Akkadian history, Babylonian history, it goes back to the first written language, which is cuneiform. And you have proto-cuneiform. And this goes back before the hieroglyphs of Egypt. And it's the first source of tablets that we can read about an ancient civilization through their own words, read about their theology, their day-to-day lives, that they got paid in beer,
Yeah.
all these things.
Beer.
They had beer way back when. And an interesting thing about Mesopotamia is that we have all these stories of ancient Babylon and all these sites that are found in the biblical texts. So the Old Testament, New Testament, there's references to Mesopotamia. And in the early 19th century, archaeologists and anthropologists went to Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, and they went on a search to find these archaeological sites that were mentioned in the Bible, because they were trying to prove that the Bible existed, or the stories in the Bible truly existed. These are real locations. And they found these sites. They found these ancient locations that were mentioned in the Bible. And not only did they find the locations, but they found tablets, cylinder seals. They found all these incredible things. And for the past 100+ years, they've been trying to date it properly. They've been translating it. And now we have a huge resource of these tablets and writings that you can actually just go online and read through thousands of different tablets. They've been translated all over the world. So we have this incredible resource. And when I was writing Astral Genesis, which is the first show I did with you,
Mhm.
where I was talking about Egypt and all these things, and in that book, it was focused on discovering the language of the stars. So it was the as above, so below principle, that the stories of the movement of the stars, the constellations, the sun, the moon, all these things had influence on the ancient myths, had influence on the ancient gods, and they were it was a secret language, and there was a secret language of geometry, of angles, dimensions that they would put into the hieroglyphs, that they would put into the ancient texts and work. And that was detailed in Astral Genesis, the first book in this series, I'll say. But I became obsessed. Even after finishing writing Astral Genesis, it's like you've discovered a new language. And if you look at an alphabet, let's say the English alphabet has 26 letters, right? In Astral Genesis, I think I discovered 1 or 2 letters out of the alphabet.
Right. Yeah.
So it's almost like you realize that there's something more, and you have this kind of anxious, nagging feeling that you don't have a complete picture. You don't understand what you found or discovered. So this is what was going on in my mind for about a year after releasing Astral Genesis. And I think we spoke before about the first book that I wrote. It was called, or it is called, Egyptian Postures of Power, which is about Egyptian mysticism, postures, meditations, all that fun stuff from ancient Egypt, right? And that's book 1, and it talks about the sun. So it's all about the sun movements, sun meditations. There's a second book in that series. It's called Salute to the Moon. And again, that's also a mystical book, going back to Egyptian mysticism and other religious texts. And it was from writing or trying to write that book that I made the discovery with Astral Genesis. And so this year I started to sit down and said, okay, I'm going to write the moon book again. So I start going through the moon book again. And there's not too many people are aware of this, but the Sumerian moon god Nana was more prominent or more powerful than the sun god in the ancient Sumerian pantheon, which I found very interesting. He was actually he was the father of the sun god. All right, so they ranked higher in the hierarchy. And so I found that very interesting. And so I was doing research on Nana, and most people know him in the Akkadian name, he's known as Sin. So the god Sin, and then Nana is the Sumerian name for him. So I was researching Nana, and I came across an ancient tablet, which is called the Hymn of Nana, or no, sorry, not the hymn. The Herds of Nana hymn. And so I'm writing this in the moon book with many other moon deities. So the chapter was about moon deities of other cultures. And I'm going through the Herds of Nana. And in this hymn, it's discussing the moon god as basically the shepherd of cattle. And that in the heavens, in his kingdoms, he has 4 pens or cattle pens where he keeps his cattle. And then he starts numbering them, telling you how many of these cattle, how many of these bulls, how many of these cows, how many do you eat, how many are old, how many are young. So it's just this whole kind of list of telling you about his cows.
Right. Which, if you didn't know anything any better, you'd be like, okay, it's a laundry list of the gods shepherding.
Yes. Right. It makes
face value.
Right. It makes no sense. It's like,
Yeah.
this is a hymn to the god, but it just describes how many cattle he keeps in which
Hmm.
pens, right? And it gives you the exact numbers. So when I was reading these numbers, it just kind of smacked me in my face that I know these numbers. These are not random numbers. These are very specific numbers, and these numbers repeat themselves in mystical teachings that I can place throughout different cultures and
Mm.
also throughout thousands of years. So it's like, why are they mentioning these numbers? And just a preface, and it's in the new book too, but years ago, around 2009, I was very into sacred geometry, very into numbers. And I wrote a book called The Yosef Codes.
Mm.
And it's out of print, but what it was um, basically I was taking the numbers from the flower of life and the
Right.
platonic solids, and I would make these mandalas, these artworks using these sacred geometry numbers.
Hmm.
And in the back of the book, I talk about breaking down the flower of life, the 369, and then the numbers that come from the flower of life. And this is in the new book, Gates of the Anunnaki, as well. But what I was doing in this book is I was taking the specific numbers and showing like wave patterns through them, and then what numbers come from multiplying, adding, subtracting, all these different numbers of the flower of life. You get this sequence of numbers that's very, very specific,
Yeah.
based on the numbers 3, 6, and 9, right?
Right. Right.
And so when I saw the numbers in the herds of Nano, which, remember, it's almost 5,000 years old.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Early,
this,
or very early. One of the earliest written things that we have.
yes,
Yeah. And here's
yes.
this 369 playing out.
And this is like the beginning of cuneiform. So this is the beginning of written language. It's the first theological stories, writings that we can find on planet Earth,
Yeah.
right?
And that is what we have out of the ground
That's
as
correct.
far as cuneiform. So one of the things that befuddles us with history and historical things is that we only get the slice of pie that we find, and there could be more in there. There could be more to be found that tells an older story or some other form of development. A lot of the Sumerian, it's just right there. It's already done. There's not like a story of development, from what I understand. Now, I don't know, maybe that's changed in the last 20 years that I really digged into it, but it was just like, boom, there it is.
Well, we see the evolution, let's call it, because if you go back further enough, let's say going back to the first city, which is Eridu, and they could archaeologically date this site to about 53, 5400 BC. Okay,
Hmm.
that's old. That's like
Yeah,
over 7,000 years. And they're just mud brick cities. This is not,
right.
um, but they don't have cuneiform then.
Ah, okay.
Okay. The earliest things they can find from those type of archaeological sites would be clay seals. And that's
Oh,
basically it. Just kind of like stamps with
yeah.
graphics on them. And then when you get to Uruk, which is about 1,000 years later, about 4,500 BC to about 4,000 BC, this is when you start to see the introduction of something called proto cuneiform,
Mm-hmm.
which
Right.
is not really a written language yet. All right, it's more like Egyptian hieroglyphs,
Mm-hmm.
where they would put like a stamp of a pictograph of whatever the item is, and
Right.
then they would have the cuneiform. Basically, is the numbering system. So it would show
Mm-hmm.
the picture of, let's say, like ducks, and then it will say how many ducks.
Right. Or loaf
Uh,
of bread and how much it is, or something like that.
that's right. So
Yeah.
you see this evolution from going these cylinder seals or stamps to proto-cuneiform to later, which would be into the 4th and 3rd millennium. So from 4000 BC to 3000 BC, then you start to see the expansion into what we would call cuneiform, which is an actual alphabet or a written language that could express a language.
Does that track with the Egyptian hieroglyphic system and into their writing as well, or?
It's earlier,
Yeah.
but very close, very close. So that's why we say Sumerian is the first kind of civilization, and we see a lot of influence. And I know that most people will say that Sumerian and Egyptian are completely different cultures, separated, and there's nothing between them. But you can absolutely, if you read the texts and the theologies and even the symbolism, there is one-to-one comparisons between what they believed and what they believe, just different names and maybe structured differently, but the same motif, same themes, everything like that. So the reason why Sumerian is important is because this is really the oldest thing we can grab onto and say, this is real. These are real words, and we can read them today.
Do we have difficulty with what we have from the Egyptians in doing the same thing? Is it less straightforward and down to earth with the Egyptians writing?
I would say, I actually found that the Sumerians was actually a little simpler to understand when you start reading their texts.
It's more regular.
It's just very straightforward. Whereas the Egyptian texts, especially like the pyramid texts, they're very mystical.
Right.
They're very deep, and unless you have any understanding of those type of teachings, you'll be quite lost in the language, where this is very straightforward.
Yeah. And as far as the cultures, it's just a desert between the two. It's not like it's that insurmountable of a space. It's not on the other side of the globe or anything like that. But you are finding that 369 as something which is obviously in Egypt. You're seeing it in Sumeria play out as well, back as early as we can find history in the traditions. And
That's
there
right.
it is, right? And the numbers of the stars, or whatever you want to call them, the sheep or whatever they may be, is things that add up to a 3, add up to a 6, or add up to a 9. Is that how that works?
It's a little more complicated than that, because just like the Egyptian writings, it's not like they're handing it to you and saying, here it is.
Right.
It takes a little more effort. And
yeah.
Basically, the reason I mentioned the 369 is that the Sumerians basically created our numbering system. So everything that we do today, be it the hours of the day, 24 hours divided by 12 or 2 times 12, and then 60 seconds, 60 minutes, they had the base 60 numbering system. This is what they're famous for. They divided the heavens. They created the angles, so 360 degrees. The reason why we say 360 degrees, that comes from Sumerians. So they not only created the numbering system, the hours, the minutes, the seconds, they created the calendar, they created the divisions of heaven, they created all these things based on numbers in a very ancient time in our history. And I mean, that's very well established,
right.
Well known. You can go on Wikipedia, they'll tell you all about that, right? There's no debate about that the Sumerians did this. And this is why we're influenced by these numbers. But in the sacred text, they use these numbers in a very interesting way that tell a story that they shouldn't know. And
but they shouldn't know.
They shouldn't know. For example, these numbers could add up to the circumference or the diameter of the Earth.
Right.
The distance between the Earth and the moon, the precession of the stars, 25,920 years. These are very, very specific numbers that I don't know exactly when, but it's in modern times that we figured out these numbers to be correct. How did we figure out?
To be correct. Verified.
Yeah, to verify the let's say the miles distance between the Earth and the moon, or the size of the sun.
Right.
So these are very specific numbers.
Right.
Yet we find these numbers being repeated in tablets. They're not saying that it's the Earth. They're not saying it's the moon. But for example, the example we used of the herds of Nana, he is the god of the moon, right?
Yeah.
And the numbers he's using to quantify his cattle are numbers that are associated with the Earth and the moon.
In relationship to each other and their size?
That's correct.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So so again, they're not telling us straightforward, this is what it is.
Right.
But, once you understand these numbers and they continually show up. Now, it goes deeper than that. And I outline that in the book, because it's not just about the scales of planets and distances and things like this that they knew. This is something much deeper. And what has really interested me in this type of work is that this is a type of sequence of numbers that's more like a fractal.
Right.
It's more of this kind of like divine thumbprint of some type of higher intelligence or a higher order or a higher pattern. There's whatever we see in this world, whatever our reality is somehow influenced by this sequence or pattern of numbers.
Specific to what's related in this myth of Inanna or Nana?
In multiple myths. So in the book, I lay out multiple tablets, multiple stories and even biblical texts that use the repetition of these numbers. If you study theology or ancient texts, you'll come across numbers like 72. You keep hearing the number 72. Keep hearing the number 108. Right? Even in Buddhism, Hinduism, 108 is a sacred number, right? Mm-hmm. So the question is why? Why are these numbers sacred? What do they mean? And why is it mentioned in this story and not that story? Mm-hmm. So this is kind of my avenue of exploration, per se.
Yeah.
And what it really comes down to is the Sumerians, or whoever taught the Sumerians, because we really don't know how far this goes back, because we have, like I say, the evidence of the tablets. And, the tablets go back as far as when cuneiform was written, a written language. So it doesn't go that far back, maybe 5,000 years at most. The question is this part of an oral tradition that goes back thousands of years before that? Because once we get into these stories, like you said, it's almost like they've just appeared fully formed.
Yeah. And the oral tradition seems to be the route of information previously. And even today, I would say that's done, and people don't really realize they're doing it, but passing things along word of mouth. I believe the Upanishads were also that way. They were originally oral traditions and stories that were passed down, knowledge that was passed, that was brought to, once the time of writing came about, these were written down, probably after they were vetted to be like very sacred and special.
And
Yeah.
when you view the ancient creation myths, for example, especially if you're going from Sumeria to Akkadian to Babylonian, they're not the same.
Right.
As in, there are many stories of creation. There are many very similar stories of creation, but they're all unique and different. So it's not like they have this kind of one story and one truth.
Right. Yeah.
It was different. So again, like you, I was brought into this information from Zachariah Sitchin, right? I have the 12th Planet book and all these things. And when I read it like 20 years ago, it just like blew my mind, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't have any other resources or sources to kind of go outside of that type of thought. And as you're in this community, you realize that the ancient alien type hypothesis is really formed around Zachariah Sitchin and Chariots of the Gods, Eric von Däniken.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So those are the monoliths that basically created this platform for this ancient alien type narrative that we're still going through the cycles of continually,
Yeah. Yeah.
But from that background, and then going into the tablets and rereading them every single word, like I did with the Egyptian side of things, from the mystical point of view, from the theological point of view of reading these texts with the eye of mysticism, it's completely different.
Yeah.
It's a completely different story. And I can see how easily things can be mistranslated and put into different contexts. But once you kind of take those words and say, and put them in kind of the mystical framework of the stars, the seasons, the cycles, and laying it out with not only their own words, but their own pictures, their own cylinder seals. Suddenly it's like, once you see it that way, you can't see it any other way.
Right.
There's this one example, like you'll see a very famous picture of Ishtar, and she's holding in her hands this rod and this circle. And no one really has a satisfactory answer to what that is, right? But if you're reading the Descent of Inanna, okay, which is like almost 5,000 years old text from the tablet, when she goes into the underworld, she is stripped of these objects that she's holding in her hand. And it literally says in the tablet that she had to get, that the lapis measuring rod and line had to be taken from her.
Right.
Which she was carrying in her hands.
Yeah.
Which was an astrological measuring tool. So it tells you right in the text what she's holding in her hand.
Right. There's not a mystery there.
No.
Visually, there's a mystery because we don't have that implement right now to reference to. So we have to fabricate or create some potential or possible, fill in the gaps with that mystery. But if there is a written source, which there is, that actually says, this is what our tradition says we have drawn here.
Yes.
You can kind of get to the root of the truth there.
Yeah. And, just to even continue down that kind of thought, I didn't put this in the book, but, I'll tell it right on your show, is that when you see the pictures of the Anunnaki, which again is another loaded word, and you see them with the pine cone and the water bucket, and they have these kind of wristwatches.
Right.
if you zoom in on the wristwatches, like if you go to the reliefs and zoom in on them, it's actually chamomile flower.
Right. Yeah.
And the chamomile flower is the symbol of Ishtar. It's still the national symbol of Iraq. If you go to the Ishtar gate, it's the chamomile flower.
Yeah.
And the lion. And the reason
Yeah.
is that Ishtar is the spring and summer. And this is when the chamomile flower blooms. So it's beautiful,
Yeah.
And kings would wear a bracelet with the chamomile flower on it to symbolize their kingship given to them by Ishtar.
There you go.
So this is history. This is like written down. And if you are part of that culture, you would know this.
There's no mystery.
There's no mystery.
Right. Yeah.
But when you come into this whole other side of things where we don't understand these things, then our mind runs wild and we say, this is what we believe it is. And then the more we repeat it, the more it becomes real in this side of the world.
But an illusion. I mean, I think that's one of the things that history does, is that if it's not written, that's a whole another story, but it's written by the victors, and it's that passed down the line kind of thing that does get lost. We do lose our history quite often, apparently. And, that's where things do get lost. A culture is gone. Nobody speaks Sumerian. So these ideas, these implements, imagery all survive from this culture that no longer exists. So if there's nobody to carry that down beyond the written word from that time, it's a watch. It's a timepiece that has no meaning to be there, only relevance to the current age, because we can only relate what we have now to these mysteries. We can only fill the gaps of that mystery with what we have now, which leads us down a lot of weird, directions. I think one of the, now that we were talking more about it, one of the vibes I got off of the 12th planet that I just didn't like was the sterileness and the very devoid of spirituality that the information imparted. For me, it felt like, oh, this is very, very like non-spiritual. There's no spirit here. And people, we as people, as humans, have always been exceptionally linked to the spiritual realm of things. And this book was just basically saying, no, none of that's actual. Now it's all very modern and atheistic. And it's like, that's not really how it was ever.
But it's true. Remember I said there's different creation stories?
Yeah.
And remember, we're talking about thousands of years.
Right.
And, the Sumerians had their own culture for thousands of years. Then it was taken over by the Akkadians, which was relatively short.
Yeah.
The Akkadian conquest. And then you had the Neo-Babylonians or the Babylonians, which kind of carried through, but they were their own unique culture.
Right.
So we're separated by thousands of years, but they still maintain the gods. They still maintain this. And the gods changed, depending on the city that you lived in. You had different deities, different patron gods.
Yeah.
What made Babylonian so powerful was the change of the gods. So before it was the god there was Enlil. He was the supreme god in Babylon, and he was basically usurped by Marduk.
Yeah.
Marduk. And so he, having that god changed the culture, changed the civilization, the stories changed. And once you get into the Neo-Babylonian time, this is the time frame where the Old Testament starts to be written.
Right.
So you see kind of like a shift in consciousness towards this kind of king of the gods, which is basically what Marduk is. He's the king of the gods.
Which is really a culture trying to absorb another culture. That's the way I looked at it. Marduk was an attempt to say, okay, you can have your gods, but we have the one god that's in charge of them all, and his name is Marduk, the usurper.
Exactly.
Right.
And when you're looking through that lens of that culture and that kind of um, theology or
Mm.
new theology, you start to kind of see the similarities between that and the Old Testament. In fact, and this is what I did in the new book, The Gates of the Anunnaki, is we broke down these different stories. And one of the greatest stories of all time is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hmm.
And there are so many things in the Epic of Gilgamesh that are basically taken and rewritten in the Old Testament.
Yeah. So
Lit-
many.
so and almost word for
Yeah.
word.
Yeah. Well, that one of the funny things that I found about that story, or the truth of I don't know if they were missionaries, but devout Christians that were really looking to validate the Bible in the time of the scientific revolution, was that they wanted to validate this book was real. The things in here were real. And they discovered that, yes, the stories were real, but they also found these tablets that said that the Bible wasn't the original story. It's kind of like this little swerve that happened there. Older stories that were the same but older, and with different names, but the same kind of like storyline.
Like, Gilgamesh um, is literally the Nephilim in the Bible.
Hmm. Oh, there you go. Yeah,
So
taller, 2/3 divine. That whole bit, right?
exactly. And basically, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the reason why um, the people rebelled against him was because he took all the women.
Mm.
So
Right. Sounds very familiar. Yeah.
exactly.
Old
So
Testament.
you have all these stories, and it's the first story, or it's the oldest story that has the reference to the Great Flood,
Right.
which predates the Bible by at least 1,500 years,
Yeah.
at least.
As far as we know, because that story might have been passed down generation,
Yes, before that.
even before. Yeah.
But, and we really get into the discussion in the book about um, the ark that was told to the Sumerian Noah, who
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
in the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
and the instructions to build the ark. Um, they gave the dimensions of the ark with very specific numbers, and if you actually drew it out and using the schematics of what they said, you realize that this is not an ark he's giving instructions for. So it's just
Yeah.
another way of transferring knowledge in a hidden way.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And I, looking at the book, I love how it's laid out. I think you delve into it in a really good way. It brings the information out in such a way that's very understandable. It is still very deep, but it is very approachable because there's a lot of imagery that helps in the book. So that's not just concepts being written down, it's actual visual helpers along the way. The arc being a very interesting gematria type of image. It reminds me of a couple things, but one of the things that it reminds me of is a labyrinth, the idea of a labyrinth, and also underground caverns
Hmm.
as a potential that maybe it was a way to um, diagnose a way to dig or something like that. I'm not really sure, but what did you get off of that? What is your thoughts on the design that comes about from those numbers?
My personal belief um, is that these numbers, this type of geometry, um, it's the secret of the circle and the square.
Hmm.
It's the basis of the geometry or the sacred numbers that have been passed down through secret orders, secret societies, and that within this geometry of the arc and the numbers that are produced by the geometry of the arc, basically is the blueprint of heaven and earth. It's the fractal of God, or the fingerprint of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gets it's a rabbit hole. That's all I could say.
Yeah,
It's a
right.
very deep mystical understanding that one way of defining creation, or defining reality, or defining God, is through numbers.
Yeah,
And once you understand those numbers and that pattern, suddenly you will start to see God in everything, and it can be defined.
right. Well, if you take that and you superimpose that on the story that's being told, one of the most valuable things you can take into the future, if you were to pass something on to your children or to future cultures when you knew that all was lost, what would you put in that ark? I think you would put the seed of civilization, or the seed of consciousness, in that ark, so that it could be again revitalized, discovered, and made anew again.
And you just hit the nail on the head. That is the purpose, in my opinion.
Of an ark.
That is literally the purpose of the ark. It's the purpose of the pyramids. These are, like, for example, the pyramid is a megalithic vault. And everyone's like, well, what's the secret of the pyramid?
Yeah.
And you just tell them the pyramid.
Yeah.
You know?
It is it. Yeah,
It is it.
Do
is
the math.
the secret.
Do the math.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing like what you just said, is that another way of preserving this information is through this kind of written language. It's through storytelling. And we don't give credit to storytelling, but we are a species of storytellers.
Right.
This is how we transfer information from one person to another. And if everything else goes down, all right, all the books are burned, no more computers or anything like this, the only way that we can transfer what we learned from our ancestors is through word of mouth.
Yeah. To be made orphans in the forest once again, if we are in that place, if everything gets wiped out by a, solar flare or whatever, we'll need to pass this information down again the old-fashioned way. Although we have all this great technology and this ability to make paper and things like that, and we have the knowledge that's already there, we're already seeded with this civilization. All could be wiped out as far as the past goes, but we'll still have that infinite source from the numbers themselves.
And when we look at our ancestors, what we're taught in the mainstream is that they weren't very smart.
Yeah, right.
They didn't really know what they were doing, copper chisels and hammer type of thing.
Loincloths, of course, you got to remember they're just wearing, one piece of cloth around their waist.
So, we're taught that basically you're far superior. So don't even look back there. There's nothing that you're going to find that's better than what you have right now. But remember, they come from a completely different world than us. And in that world, they had figured out the movement of their reality. They were able to look at the sky, know what time it is, know what season it was, know how much more time will pass before they have to harvest seeds, plant. They knew what stars were in which direction. So they can navigate the planet without holding up a compass.
Without the need for physical technology to get them there. That's what I think is very important, is that they could walk with maybe very little, a bag perhaps, and they can get anywhere in the world if they just have a few little items and maybe some stores of food or whatever. They can go anywhere. They didn't need the trappings of a mine and all of these other gears and implements to tell time or read the stars. You could just look up, measure, and know where they're going.
And we've lost that ability.
Yeah.
So when I was going back, and like I said, this is this new book is really based out of the Astral Genesis book. And I was trying to find the roots of this plant.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept getting drawn back to the ancient Levant, which is the area from Egypt to basically Iran to ancient Anatolia, which is where we find Göbekli Tepe.
Mm.
And so you have this Mesopotamia area, which is the cradle of civilization, but it reaches back into the Neolithic time to Göbekli Tepe that we're looking at about between 10 and 12,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age.
Yeah.
And I'm finding this information I'm finding, how do I say this? Evidence of some type of knowledge being passed through these Neolithic cultures around this site, around this. It's a very large area, but it's still kind of centralized area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the point of this book, is that whoever taught these people or passed down this knowledge, this had to have been something that was known at Göbekli Tepe. So we're going back to like the last ice age, which would mean that was this information, this knowledge about numbers, geometry, cycles, stars, planets, like all this kind of theology, was this um, the blueprint of civilization that is the reason why we're sitting here today talking to one
Right.
another, because those cultures brought that forward from the last ice age and taught down through the generations.
I mean, if you went through a major cataclysmic event of any sort or multiples, one thing would be very important, and that would be to pass down that which is going to teach and teach and teach and develop. And, a lot of things get lost in tragedy. Internal knowledge and the spoken word is something that you can keep and pass on and develop culture around that storytelling in a way that it passes on a whole tale that could be told from the stars and then at some point written down.
And
Yeah.
in that area as well, especially in the Neolithic period, there is evidence of great floods, not just
Yeah.
one, but many great floods in that area, where the Mediterranean overflooded, the Euphrates, the Tigris
Mhm.
overflooded and just wiped out areas.
Yeah.
Um, so these are very real scenarios that happened to our ancestors that is used as a theme in their stories, more like a
Right.
warning, because it will happen again in our future.
Yeah. Yeah. That's and it has very recently, I would say, a great flood, what we call a tsunami, has happened several times now in the last 20 years. When you call something the great anything, then it's something that's pretty magnanimous and, you know, wipes out a good bit of people. I would say the Indian Ocean earthquake that happened 2000, is that 3 or 5? I think it was 2005 that happened. That was like 100,000 people died in that. It's a
Yep.
pretty big event. I'd say that was a great flood of sorts. Um, and
And if you're
Japan,
cut off from the outside world,
right?
like the only people you can kind of tell that this event happened in our lifetime is through stories passed
Yeah,
down to the children.
right. If you don't have the trappings of all of these great ways of communication and nobody else knows, you'd want them to know this great story that they survived, that they lived through.
Yes.
Um, Something that you bring up in this book that I think is very interesting as well is Da Vinci. This isn't a place that a lot of people go when they're talking about ancient cultures, and yet he was tapping into the same geometry, the same lessons of the triad, the 369. Uh, what did you find out in Da Vinci's work that drew you back to Sumeria?
Um, it was actually just a lucky coincidence, which there's no such thing as a lucky
Right.
coincidence. During the writing of Astral Genesis, it was all about the solar myth, right? It was about the sun moving through the constellations. And the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci, in mystical circles, they speak about how the Last Supper is really an allegory of the solar mythos, which is Christ, the sun in the sky, and the 12 apostles is the 12 constellations. And there's many people that have interpreted it, have broken it down and deconstructed it. So I was using it in presentations. I was using the image of the Last Supper in presentations to describe the movement of the sun through the constellations. And I know that Leonardo da Vinci was very into these mystical teachings. He was very into sacred geometry and numbers, and I can see that it was laid out in a very specific way. And the first thing I did was, obviously, because of Astral Genesis, if people know this book, I always check to see two angles of importance, which is 23.5 degrees, which is the tilt of the Earth. So I look to see if there's any angles in the painting at 23.5 degrees. And I did find them. They're perfectly aligned to the apostle that represents the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn.
Oh, of course.
So he put it in the exact place. And if you look at the Last Supper, they're leaned over at a slope of exactly 23.5 degrees. So I'm like, oh, okay. So Leonardo da Vinci knows the code. Great.
Right. Of course.
And then I said, okay, and the next angle I have to look for is 15 degrees. And because 15 degrees is the number of the sun, it's the movement of the sun in the sky per hour is 15 degrees. So from the edge of the table to Jesus's eye is 15 degrees. So it's the eye of the sun. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Horus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Eye of Providence. So all of this is in the book.
Eye of Ra. Yeah.
And then I said, okay, well, let's see if the numbers from the Sumerian tablets are inside this picture. So I took all the numbers, and when you put all the numbers together, what you're actually getting is a proportion. So you can have them as circles or squares, but it's a proportion, a proportional number between them, or a ratio.
Right.
And once you get the I'll call it, like, how the Masons will have like the keystone, like you have like one piece.
Yeah.
Once you find that one key or that one geometry, and Leonardo would hide this key in the painting, which I show in the book what that key is. Once you know what the key is, you know what number to put in that key. And once you put that number in, suddenly the entire blueprint of the entire painting is there in front of you. All the numbers are perfectly aligned. And it just completely blew me away, because not only was the numbers of the angles put in there, but the angles or the proportions or the fractal of heaven and earth, which is going back to Sumerian tablets, those numbers that we talk about throughout the book, they're represented in the Last Supper. And they're also represented in his other works as well, which I included. Yeah. So I put the question out there, who taught Leonardo this knowledge? Because again, this goes back to the first book, Astral Genesis, this is information that had to have been taught. It's not something we just figure out. This is a taught knowledge in a very specific way. And Leonardo da Vinci is literally hiding it in the picture, just like the Egyptians did in their hieroglyphs. So this is a language that's not a language. And the only way to see the language is to be taught the language. And this is what I'm trying to show in the book, that there is a a lost hidden language of numbers and geometry that was taught to these priests, pharaohs, masters, initiates, whoever these people were. And they were put in artifacts, paintings, sculptures, architect, and even myths and biblical texts to maintain that knowledge through the millennia.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. And I highly recommend everybody get this and Astral Genesis, because that is a really great foundation to learning this code and these ways of looking at this, these pictographs and this information in such a way that there's a knowledge and a known concept that comes out of it that makes more sense than filling the mystery with some randomness that just fits. This is very, it's almost obvious. It's almost right in front of us that it's hard to miss. Like, oh, okay. Once you see it, you start to see it everywhere.
And this
everybody's doing it.
And this is what I love about this information is that it's just numbers.
Right.
It's just geometry. And it's like if the numbers were off, it wouldn't work.
And it's having that key too. I mean, you have to have the key in the Masonic language to unlock the hidden key. You have to know what the word is that fits in, so that all the other letters add up or line up. There's no reason why this wouldn't be done through all the different systems in the past.
I would say that it's more of a universal language art, as in, you can go to a different culture that has a completely different language, and you could look at their symbols of letters. You have no clue what you're looking at.
Yeah.
But then next to it, you see a picture of somebody doing something, and you're like, "Oh, I understand."
Right.
It's a universal language.
Are you seeing it in other cultures? And do you plan on another book in the series for another place, perhaps?
We'll see. We'll see. Because like I said, I'm always trying to finish this moon book. And every time I try to write it, something else comes up and I have to stop and write a new book.
Right. Well, get started on that.
I'm gonna get started on that. But that's the thing is it will reveal when it reveals.
Yeah.
Right now I feel like I've hit the boundary.
Okay.
But I'm sure my curiosity will take me to the next boundary.
Yeah.
When that happens, who knows? But
very good. Well, Jason, again, thank you so much, and really look forward to diving into the new version that I haven't seen, and more work that you have coming.
Thanks again.
Take care.